A pleasant day to everyone watching this webinar at the UPOU Network's website, UPOU Network's FB page, and UPOU YouTube channel. Yes, we are available for viewing using these three options, and as of this morning, we have about 805 registered listeners. My name is Connie Habito, and I'm currently the program chair of the Diploma Master of Environment and Natural Resources Management at the University of the Philippines Open University. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Just a few reminders before I introduce our esteemed speakers for today's webinar. Please send your questions via UPOU Network's chat room, YouTube comment box, or Facebook comment box. Questions will be addressed after the presentation of the three speakers. To receive your e-certificate, you must answer the evaluation form. The QR code or link to the evaluation form will be posted at the end of the program. It will be available for 6 hours after the webinar. Okay, let's start. Wildlife has been blamed as the source of the current disease coronavirus caused by the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. Specifically, bats and pangolins have taken starring roles in this current pandemic. Is wildlife a friend or a foe? In today's webinar, we will be listening to wildlife experts to hear their take on the matter. Professor Alviola will talk about viruses isolated from bats. Emerson C. will discuss about our current relationship with pangolins. And lastly, Dr. and Professor J.C. Gonzalez will discuss pandemics and wildlife in this Anthropocene. Are we doing the right thing in terms of not allowing this pandemic to happen again? My screen. Sandali lang po, ha? Sandali lang po. Screen. Okay. Something is wrong with my... Okay. Lama. Okay. Bats and pangolins have taken starring roles in the current pandemic. No? So we are going to hear this talk today. And are we doing the right thing in terms of not allowing this pandemic to happen? Okay, now I will be introducing the first speaker, Philip Alviola. Philip Alviola is an associate professor at the Institute of Biological Sciences, University of the Philippines, Los Baños, and a wildlife biologist for over 23 years, with a publication track record of more than 40 research articles in scientific journals. He is a recipient of the DOST-NAST Outstanding Young Scientist in 2017 and received a commendation by the Philippine Senate under House Resolution number 141 in 2019 as one of the 8 Filipinos included in the top 100 scientists in the Asia-Pacific region. His area of expertise includes ecology of Philippine wildlife, mammalian ecology and taxonomy, cave ecology, conservation biology, and ecology of bat zoonotics. Professor Alviola's work in mammalian ecology and taxonomy has resulted in publication of 16 scientific papers in international peer-reviewed journals, including description of 12 new animal species in the Philippines. He has also conducted research in cave ecology, where to date, he has surveyed more than 100 caves and cave systems. Philip also conducts bat zoonotic research since 2007 with various international virologists, which resulted in the discovery of several novel virus genotypes, including coronavirus from Philippine bats. Philip holds a master's degree in wildlife studies from UP Los Baños and is currently a PhD candidate in forest biological sciences by research with the same university. Let us all welcome Professor Philip Alviola with a Zoom clap.
Okay, maraming salamat po, Ma'am Connie, and a pleasant and breezy morning to all of the viewers. Okay, so I'm going to start my presentation. So the title of my talk is on current knowledge on potential zoonotic viruses carried by Philippine bats. So essentially what I'm going to do is I am going to report the results of the UPLB University of Tokyo bat virus research from 2007 to 2020. Uh, as a disclaimer, I've highlighted my title. I'm a bat biologist, not a virologist. So for the Q&A later this morning, I think it would be very, very difficult for me to answer virology questions. So, but let's start right away. Okay, right. So how did we start? Okay, the SARS outbreak back in 2002 and then reemerged in 2003, well over to 2004, created an endemic that caught, infecting more than 8,000 people and resulted to almost 800 deaths. And a lot of countries, definitely across North America, Asia, definitely in Europe, have been infected with this SARS outbreak. And careful research has shown that the intermediate host was traced back to the mask civet or the Paguma larvata. It's shown here, and eventually traced the source to Rhinolophus cynicus or the Chinese horseshoe bat. So what happens is that a lot of virologists scrambled double time to so there was a renewed research effort looking into virus in bats. So essentially what happened is that with the SARS plus bats, our research team was formed. So it was formed in 2007 when Dr. Joseph Osangkay of UPLB College of Veterinary Medicine, as shown in the picture, and Dr. Yoshikawa from University of Tokyo discussed about conducting bat virology studies here in the Philippines. So what came out of that conversation was that a composite team of several institutions, UPLB, including the Museum of Natural History, College of Veterinary Medicine, Institute of Biological Sciences, and several universities in Japan. So formed together to study the different viruses found in bats. So this composite team is composed of virologists, microbiologists, veterinarians, bat ecologists, and definitely museum technicians. So what we did so far in the last 13 years, starting in 2007, is that we've sampled in 11 different provinces, such as in the point in Pangasinan, in the southern Tagalog region, for example, in Laguna, in Tanay, and even in NCR, and of course in Polillo. And then we went south, going to Bicol region, and then in Panay Island, and then in the regions of Davao, in Mindanao. And among these 11 provinces, we've also sampled in 19 caves. So from there, we captured about 30 bat species, and representing about 1,000 bat individuals were captured using standardized netting methodologies. And from the bats, we took oral and anal swabs. We collected fecal pellets, and then for a very limited number of specimens, we collected we collected internal organs. And the lab work done was using serology and sequencing techniques like PCR and the whole genome sequence. So these are the bat sampling techniques for the benefit of wildlife biologists who are now watching. So we've used mist nets here, shown here, and then we've also used other quite a number of netting techniques as well. For example, we've used harp traps, for capturing insectivorous bats. And then we've also used tunnel traps, just like a mosquitero. And then this is what a bat looks like when it gets entangled in a net. So it's going to take a lot of patience in trying to tease out all the different strands of the net and trying to get out the bat. Okay, so let's now go to the main results of my talk. So what are our published results? So I'm going to talk to you about six different viruses or virus family that we've uncovered or recovered from Philippine bats. First off is coronavirus. This is the top of the town, the virus of the hour. It's causing uh, untold number of deaths here in the world. Um, Back in 2009, we published a paper, Bat Coronaviruses and Experimental Infection of Bats in the Philippines. And we sampled in UP Los Baños, in UP Diliman, and Ninoy Aquino Parks and Wildlife Center. So this is the Biodiversity Management Bureau ground office in Quezon City. And we've uncovered two different types of coronavirus. One is the alpha coronavirus, and the other one is the beta coronavirus. And for the alpha coronavirus, we only got it from an insectivorous bat, Scotophilus culi. So this bat is always found, usually found in attics of houses, and is strongly associated with human habitations. And then for the beta coronavirus, we've detected it all in fruit bats, particularly here for Cynopterus brachiotis and Tinochirus jagori, and it has a relatively high prevalence. So for Eucalus banos, of the 21 samples or 21 bats that we've captured, 71% of those had beta coronavirus. In UP Diliman, half of those, half of those had beta coronavirus. And in the Ninoy Aquino Parks and Wildlife Center, we caught 7 individuals with beta coronavirus. One very interesting note here is that the SARS-CoV-2, the virus that is afflicting us today, is included in the genus beta coronavirus. So essentially, the the beta coronavirus that we captured here in UP Los Baños, UP Diliman, and some parts of Quezon City is related, somehow related to SARS-CoV-2. Next, hantavirus. Hantavirus, it's under the family Bunyaviridae that causes several human diseases. For example, the lacrosse encephalitis and the Rift Valley fever in Africa. So hantavirus essentially comes from rodents. So for example, we have musculus and Rattus norvegicus. So these rodents are invasive and considered as pests in households. And hantavirus comes in two variants: the hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome and the hantavirus pulmonaris syndrome. You may have heard back in start of April or end of March that there was a new disease that's coming out from China on top of the coronavirus that has been that started from there. Uh, so this was the one that hantavirus that you may remember it. In 2016, we published a paper essentially describing eight Kaposi sarcoma virus and EBV is the Epstein-Barr virus. These are pathogenic to humans. So Epstein-Barr virus usually causes fever, swelling of the lymph nodes, whereas the Kaposi sarcoma virus is usually cancerous, can lead to cancer. And we've also detected this virus, Gamma-herpes virus, but different genotype in the Davao region as well. Right. Number 5 is also captured Theropine orthoreovirus. Okay, so we published a paper entitled First Isolation and Characterization of Theropin orthoreovirus in Fruit Bats in the Philippines. So PRV or Theropin orthoreovirus, it's known to cause respiratory tract infection in humans. For example, the Miyazaki Bali 2007 strain. Uh, there's a genotype that we've isolated from 9 fruit bats composing of 2 species, here rosetus and Ionicteris pilea. So these 2 species of fruit bats are cave dwelling. They sometimes they form colonies numbering up to 10,000 or individuals, and in Samoa Island they form up to 1.8 million individuals. And we've also did some serological testing, and out of the 84 fruit bats tested, 76 tested positive for the PRV neutralizing antibodies. So, which means that these fruit bat individuals were also exposed to had prior exposure to PRV or for the virus. And then, so that's our published results. What about our unpublished results? So these are the results which the fieldwork we've done pretty recently. So we haven't yet published. So it's most of it are still under analysis. So first off, the Henipa virus, Nipah NIV, and the Hendra HEV virus. So these family of viruses, particularly Nipah and Hendra, belongs to some of the most lethal viruses known to man. So WHO classified it to be at the biosafety level 4. So back in 2014, I am not sure if most of you have read this or watched this. It came in the news in a major TV channel in Region 12, particularly in Sultan Kudarat, in the municipality of uh, Ninoy Aquino, Benigno Aquino Senior or Senior. Yeah. Uh, there was an acute encephalitis syndrome, and resulted to 10 fatalities or 10 deaths. And this was reported in October of 2014. But the paper that came out with main authors, Dr. Ching of the RITM, um, they actually the virus the virus started back in between March and May 2014. So, and they, upon inspection, so they found that there were 9 individuals that died, and this was a result of consumption of horse meat, and some of those that died participated in the slaughter of the meat. Others died because of consumption of the meat, and there were also others that died because of particularly health workers who took care of the patients. So Nipah virus and Hendra first showed up in Australia, where particularly in pig farms, and then in Nipah, I think in pig farms as well, or in horse farms. And the lethality of this fatality rate is quite high. So so some of our collaborators became very curious, became very interested in looking into Henipa virus and looking further into if there are Henipa virus that confirm there are Henipa virus in Philippine bats. Because in places like in Australia and in Malaysia where this virus showed up, they've isolated these viruses from flying foxes or those big giant bats that have wingspans over 2 meter, 1.5 meters. So our field work back in 2019 in Del Carmen in Siargao. So we went there, and then we captured several species of bats. I think we captured about 10 species or 8 or 10 species, and we tested 81 individuals. And we tested for antibodies of Hendra and Nipah, and only 4 individuals of Hypsideros diadema tested positive for HEV and NIV antibodies. But further testing with RT-PCR indicated that they were negative for NIV genome. But we still my collaborators are not yet finished with the examination, and it would be very interesting well to look further what's going to be the results of the once the examinations have been finished. But one interesting feature here is that at least four individuals of the one species, Hypsideros diadema, has been exposed to the henipavirus. And our very recent fieldwork back in March 2 or 3, just a few days before the lockdown. So we went to Biak na Bato National Park. This is in Bulacan. So where upon examination of wing membrane, so one of our collaborators found pox particles, so representing pox virus in the wings of a fruit bat, Cynopterus brachiotis. So, and so right now we haven't yet looked into the wing part. So, but what it looks like, and taken from a very recent study by David et al. 2020, looking into pox virus in fruit bats in Israel. So this is what the rashes and the lesions would look like on wing membranes. Uh, and it's very interesting because as a bat ecologist, so I've been working with bats for more than 20 years, and I've been seeing these kinds of rashes and lesions on bat wings but I'm not sure which species that is. But uh, it's probably a call to other bat biologists or other wildlife biologists to have a look for these lesions and rashes, and this could be a sign of the pox virus. And of course, with the name itself, pox verde. So these includes the pathogens smallpox, which have been responsible for a number of million of deaths worldwide, and monkeypox. Right. So with all those published and unpublished results that we have spanning 13 years of capturing bats, conducting research all over the Philippines, so we still have a wish list. There's still our research efforts are still continuing. Right now we have stopped because of the coronavirus, but what we have here are future projects, and of course wish list, what we want to do in the future. So essentially what we've done over the past 13 years is essentially going into the different localities, sampling bats, and then doing serological and sequencing techniques. So right, and then as you can see here in this map, so we haven't really covered that much ground, even though we've been doing this for so many years now. Particularly on the island of Mindoro, we haven't done any work there. Northern Luzon, Palawan, Western Visayas, and several parts of Mindanao. So with this, we really are aching to do bat virus surveys, particularly in Palawan, in Negros, and we want to go back to the ground zero of the Henipa virus, particularly in Sultan Kudarat. And uh, we've with all the back capture bat research that we've done in all the fieldwork that we've done, we haven't really captured a single individual of a flying fox or these giant fruit bats. Uh, we haven't captured those, and um, for our next projects of the succeeding projects that we have, we actually have this as a target, as a number one of the primary targets to capture. So essentially, as we can document the presence of Nipah virus, and of course, looking into its the viral load or the viral diversity. And another wish list, or probably future project, is we want to do some sampling at the four corners of the Philippines, particularly in Batanes, in the north, and in the east, probably in Samar, in the west, definitely in the southern tip of Palawan, or Tawi-Tawi, and in the south, most probably in Sarangani Island, Sarangani province. Um, we we have studies to show that several bats, particularly these giant flying foxes, are flight uh, uh, capable of flight about 100 kilometers from their roost site. And actually, we did some limited telemetry studies in Polillo Island. Actually, we inserted a GPS tracker, collar tracker, and a giant flying fox. And 10 days after, we tracked it on the island of Palau, which is around 1,000 kilometers from Polillo Island. So they are quite, these giant flying foxes are capable of uh, flying transnational boundaries. So some of them could probably fly in the north to Taiwan, some of them could fly to Borneo, or some of them could fly probably to some parts, northern parts of Indonesia. And another wish list, which actually in one of my collaborations where we are preparing a proposal, is we do a field by surveillance so we can monitor viral shedding and spillovers on bats. One particular very interesting place to do that is, of course, here in UP Los Baños. So we know for a fact, based on the results of our studies, that there are beta coronaviruses here in UP Los Baños. So we'd want to do a longitudinal study, so looking, uh, trapping several bat individuals per month, looking into their bat attributes, such as reproductive condition, and trying to show um, how what is the timing of their viral shedding. Is it does it coincide with their pregnancy, or does it coincide with weaning season? So we want to look into that. And of course, lastly is we want our research to be holistic as possible. So trying to leverage a One Health approach to conducting bat virus studies. So we're not only looking into the virus, we're also looking into the ecology of the bats, and of course the interaction of those for the whole community, for the whole ecosystem. Right. Um, so essentially just a advocacy or a takeaway message. So at least take before I end. So what is happening right now is that well, virus is naturally occurring, and for bats, some of these viruses have been locked inside those bats for millions, or even sometimes even up to 100 thousands of years. And with the narrowing species barrier, the narrowing interface between the animals and humans, uh, the chance for spillovers or zoonosis is highly likely, and that is what is already happening over the past several years, but definitely with the coronavirus that we have right now. And the narrowing animal-human interface has been brought about by several factors or several drivers. So first and foremost, one of those examples would be wildlife trade. Mr. Emerson C. will be talking about that later on. So wildlife trade, consumption of wildlife, consumption, eating directly of wildlife, sometimes domestication as well of wildlife, which actually led to several viruses, such as smallpox and others. Uh, and of course, habitat alteration as well has shortened the habitat that's available for bats, and and of course, this has been replaced. These habitats have been replaced by human infrastructures, and this is where the narrowing interface has happened. And of course, with the climate change, this has brought about changes in the distribution of plants and animals, and definitely has massive repercussions in the behavior of the animals. And of course, the direct human encroachment into wildlife habitats. For example, in people going into caves, such as in different parts of Asia, caves have been used as a place of worship or a place of pilgrimage. So some of these caves can be can be labeled as can be identified as ground zero for another pandemic to happen. So so as a before I end, so what we've shown here, the composite research team from UPLB and several universities in Japan. So what we've shown here is that virologists coming from different professions, veterinarians, and wildlife biologists can work beautifully together. And our work has resulted to more than, I think, more than 11 or 12 publications altogether. And some of them, most of them have been published in high impact journals. And I would like to point this that this is the first time that I've reported the the viruses that are found in bats on a Filipino audience. And I would like to thank University of the Philippines Open University for inviting me. And so, and in behalf of the research team from UPLB from Japan, uh, thank you very much. Maraming salamat po. So this ends my talk.
Thanks for all feedback. I would like to remind the audience to please send your questions via UPOU Network's chat room, YouTube comment box, or Facebook comment box. Questions will be addressed after the third speaker's presentation. Now let's go on to our next speaker. Emerson C. is a herpetologist with research interests in natural history, introduced species, and wildlife trade. He has published numerous scientific papers and short notes in both international and national journals. He has actively advocated for the conservation of Philippine biodiversity and participates in national workshops and conferences on Philippine wildlife and conservation. He is a member of the National Research Council of the Philippines, DOST, Technical Working Group on Amphibians and Reptiles. And that group is collectively studied by a scientist called the herpetologist. Okay, and the Philippine Aquatic Red List Committee of BIFAR. He serves as a board member of the Biodiversity Conservation Society of the Philippines and a trustee of the Herp Watch Philippines. And if I may add, he is also a graduate of our Master of Environment and Natural Resources Management. Currently, he is a consultant of Traffic, the Wildlife Trade Monitoring Network, Monitor Conservation Research Society, and USAID Project Wildlife Project. Hindi po yan yung picture ni Emerson C. So can you please post the right correct picture, please? So let us all welcome Emerson C. with a Zoom thumbs up.
Thank you very much, Dr. Habito, my former professor sa UPOU. And of course, good morning to everyone. My presentation today is the possible link of pangolin consumption and the COVID-19 pandemic. So everyone's aware that the COVID-19 pandemic has a devastating effect on human health and the global economy. And in fact, we are still experiencing the, the, the negative effects. The source of the current coronavirus has been linked to bats. And it is not surprising since the other previous coronavirus outbreaks were traced to bats. For example, the SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome COVID, was traced to bats, and the intermediate host, one of the intermediate hosts, was identified as a palm civet, which in then transmitted to human. Likewise, for the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, it was traced to bats and then transmitted to camel and eventually to human. But for the current COVID-19, the intermediate host is still uncertain. An earlier study this year identified snakes as a possible intermediate host, but that particular hypothesis has been refuted. And the group identified pangolin as a possible intermediate host. In fact, there are a few studies that back up that earlier study, and they they are they are thinking that the pangolin might be the intermediate or the primary host of the COVID-19. We've been hearing a lot about the pangolin lately in the news because pangolins have been identified as the most traded wild mammals in the world. Currently, there are 8 extant pangolin species, and they occur in Africa and Asia. 4 species occur in Africa, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, and another 4 species occur throughout Asia. This is the distributional maps of the 4 species of African pangolins. As you can see, all 4 species are distributed in a few range states, and it's also similar to the Asian counterparts. They are distributed in a few states, except for the Philippine pangolin. The Philippine pangolin, as you can see on the upper right map, it's not distributed throughout the Philippines, but only in Palawan faunal region. So this makes the Philippine pangolin with the most restricted distributional range among the 8 species. So globally, the pangolins have been traded as meat. In range countries, they are being eaten as bush meat, but more recently, they are being used as luxury food item, especially in urban restaurants. Skins are being manufactured into leather goods, such as shoes and bags. And of course, the scales, they are mainly used as traditional medicine, but they are also being used as amulet against diseases and attack from wild animals in some indigenous people in range countries. In the year 2000, the CITES, this is the international agreement regarding international trade, they listed all 8 pangolin species in CITES Appendix 2. And they put out a 0 quota. So it means that any range countries are not allowed to trade pangolins, especially if they're caught in the wild. So despite this legal protection and international agreements, pangolins are still being poached and traded illegally throughout the world. In the last 20 years, about 895,000 pangolins were illegal. 895,000 pangolins were illegally traded globally. Here's a map of the trade routes. The blue lines indicate the trade of leather or skin of pangolin, and the arrows are pointing for the arrows are the indication of the direction of the trade. So as you can see, the skins were sourced from Asia and Africa, and they are going to Europe, and United States. So they are the primary consumers for leather goods. The red lines are the trade routes for scales. Again, you can see that they are being sourced in Africa and going to Asia, mainly to China. And of course, within the range states in Asia, they are also being sourced here and mostly are going to China. The yellow lines indicate the trade of pangolin meat. So this is quite different because the meat, the pangolin meats are mainly sourced in neighboring Asian countries and going again to China. So because of this massive illegal trade in pangolin, the CITES during their convention of parties in 2016 decided to transfer the listing from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1. This means that all international trade in wild-caught pangolins are prohibited. In the Philippines, the Philippine pangolin and other pangolin species are protected by the law. So for our pangolin, it was listed as vulnerable in 2004, and fast forward to 2015, the Palawan Council for Sustainable Development listed the species as critically endangered. And in the latest assessment by the DENR, it was listed as endangered. Globally, it was assessed as critically endangered by the IUCN in the late 2019. So all these assessment and listings, it means that no hunting or trade of Philippine pangolin is allowed, even to indigenous peoples. The penalty for violating the law can be as high as 12 years of imprisonment and 1 million pesos in fine. So we conducted a study regarding the trafficking of Philippine pangolins in the last 2 decades, and this is what we found. During the period of 2000 to 2017, which is an 18-year period, there were 39 seizures involving 740 Philippine pangolins. In comparison, in the last 2 years, there were 28 seizures and retrievals involving almost 7,000 Philippine pangolins. Bear in mind that we were very conservative with the comparison of these 2 periods. We actually just compared the last 2 years versus the previous 18 years. So although we were very conservative with our estimate, there were at least 9-fold increase in the last 2 years in comparison to the previous 18-year period. Okay, this shows the where the seizure occurred in the last 2 years. As you can see, the most pangolin were seized in Palawan, where it is not naturally occurring. The biggest seizure happened last year, wherein the Wildlife Authority seized more than 1,000 kilograms of pangolin scales. And for the first time in the last 20 years, there was one seizure in Mindanao involving an estimated 2,900 individual Philippine pangolins. And of course, in Luzon region, where most seizures and retrievals occurred, although the number is quite low, 34 individual Philippine pangolins, but there were more seizures in this region because this is the destination for Philippine pangolins in the illegal wildlife trade. I'm going. Here's sharing some photos of documented illegal trade in the Philippines in the last 2 years. On the left, this particular live pangolin was observed being offered for sale on the street in Manila, and fortunately, the person was aware that it is illegal, and she actually confiscated this pangolin and turned it over to the wildlife authority. On the right, as you can see, a live pangolin was offered for sale on Facebook. So we documented a couple of incidents of pangolin being offered on Facebook. We don't think that the person who offered this is the poacher or a regular trafficker, but perhaps he found the pangolin roaming around the street and decided to offer it for sale on Facebook. We also documented pangolin meat being offered in restaurants. We estimated that at least 5 restaurants in Metro Manila offered pangolin meats in the last 2 years. And this is one example where this was sent to me by a friend who happened to be eating in a restaurant in Manila and was offered by a chef if they want to buy this particular pangolin. And of course, the scales. Um, this particular case, it was about to be smuggled out of the Philippines from Cagayan de Oro going to China, but luckily it was intercepted and seized. So basically, what's going on at the moment is animal abuse and mishandling have caused zoonotic diseases, and not just with the COVID-19, but as well as mentioned by Professor Philip, with SARS, MERS, because of the wildlife trade. But uh, it's not exclusive to wild animals, but also for domesticated animals, as we have seen in avian influenza in 2003 with domesticated chickens and ducks, and what happened here in the Philippines regarding the African swine influenza with domesticated pigs. So going back to the question whether the pangolin is the intermediate host of COVID-19, the current studies have implicated the Sunda pangolin as the likely intermediate or direct host. But we always have to remember that coronaviruses are known to have multiple intermediate hosts. For example, with SARS, they also found out that badger and other species also were the intermediate hosts of the SARS coronavirus. With researchers also identified that the palm civet, the link of the palm civet and SARS coronavirus match 99.8%, with the MERS coronavirus match with the camel. But with the pangolin and COVID-19, it was only 91% match. So they're still figuring out whether pangolin is one of the intermediate hosts or not. We always have to bear in mind that illegal wildlife trade is can affect us all, as we have seen in COVID-19. So as long as we continue to see the massive increase in illegal wildlife trade, as we have illustrated in the case of the Philippine pangolin, expect us to see more pandemic due to zoonotic diseases. And I think it's very important for all of us to be more proactive in participating and reporting illegal wildlife trade to wildlife authorities. So that concludes my presentation. And again, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Emerson, for that talk about pangolins. Again, I would like to remind the audience to please send your questions via UPOU Network's chat room, YouTube comment box, or Facebook comment box. Questions will be addressed after the third speaker's presentation. Now let us introduce our third and last speaker. Dr. Professor Juan Carlos T. Gonzalez is currently a professor in zoology at the Animal Biology Division, Institute of Biological Sciences, College of Arts and Sciences, University of the Philippines, Los Baños. He completed his BS and MS both in zoology at UPLB and his Doctor of Philosophy in Zoology at the University of Oxford in 2012 through the Ford Foundation International Fellowship Program. He is currently Professor 11. He was appointed as the 11th Director of the UPLB Museum of Natural History and continues as a curator for birds at the Zoological and Wildlife Museum, which houses a large part of the world-famous Dioscoro S. Rabor Wildlife Collection. Let us all welcome Dr. Professor J.C. Gonzalez with a Zoom clap.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Professor Habito, for that very kind introduction. Again, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this third lecture for this series, for this webinar series. Again, I'm thankful for UP Open University for this opportunity to share our thoughts about wildlife and the pandemic. Amazing talks from two of my colleagues, Prof. Alviola and Prof. C. Amazing talks for everyone. And it's good because it helps me be more generalized in my talk, having those details for both pangolins and for bats. So I will share for you this today. I'll be talking about pandemics and wildlife in the Anthropocene. Okay, I think everyone's familiar with the term Anthropocene because it is our time to, just have to share it first before I play. Yeah, thank you, Pa. So, and the time of the Anthropocene where, of course, everything is anthropogenic. There's a lot of influence by man. And it's time that we look into both the impacts of what these diseases and epidemics are coming through in terms, not just with the human concept, but also with the wildlife concept, because it's always a two-way street. It's not just them affecting us, but us affecting them. So again, thank you for this opportunity to talk over our lecture series on friend or foe in the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I put up this picture. I'll explain a bit later why. So this is a large-billed crow. And here's another photo, but this is a young large-billed crow, because crows often, because of their dark color, a sort of a representation of omens. Often think about things that somebody will demise, usually tingin natin in terms of often that evil burgoying concept about blackbirds and ravens and forced crows. Actually, if you look at it, there's another set of ideas about the omens. Even the hornbill, for example, the Palawan hornbill, there are tribes in Palawan that are actually afraid of the Palawan hornbill because they think of it as another version of the omen. If a hornbill alights on their house, something will happen to somebody on the house. I don't know. Either may mamamatay, magkakasakit. So sometimes they would leave the house and build a new house. Kasi dinapon. Although the chances of a hornbill landing on your house is quite small. But again, it's a very weird concept that we have. It's interesting also that the same concept of ethno-ornithology or ethnobiology, looking into the ideas of bird lore and documenting them, is also quite endangered. So we're losing those connections from the past. Everyone is aware there's a kind of a worldwide concept of the oarfish, as you see here from Nat Geo Pictures. It's an oarfish is often associated omens or something will happen. So there's a oarfish that gets stranded. Sometimes people around the world, it's not just the Philippines, but also I think it's a more Latin influence. In Mexico, so they think that something ominous will happen if an oarfish gets stranded. So those are things in the past that we kind of get connected, but now there's a new normal, as we say it. We think of other animals as because of their connections with these outbreaks and diseases. So with the mass palm civet, we had associations with SARS. With waterfowl, we have an association with bird flu or the avian influenza because most of the waterfowl species, such as the swan, are reservoirs for the disease. And of course, now we think of bats as sources of another set of viruses, including the COVID-19. Actually, if you remember watching that movie, Contagion, at the last end of this, I don't want to do any spoilers, but the last end of the movie, it was traced down to a bat, from a pig to a bat. So I don't know if it's the same species. It was a fruit bat. I think it was a fruit bat that they used on that movie. So looking into the Anthropocene, I think everything is man-made or human influence nowadays. We influence not only the environment, also climate. We caused a lot of habitat loss from all different landscape areas. Pollution is a major issue. If you remember looking at those videos of surfers surfing on plastic clay seas, and of course animals or marine wildlife being choked by plastics. We also have moved things around because of our mobility, both air and sea. We've moved invasive alien species from one place to another. And hindi pa tayo na satisfied on. We created new organisms, not only moved organisms, but created new sets of organisms through genetic modification. And a lot of these impacts have led to extinctions. And extinctions to me is not just losing a species, but also losing the link. So there is, as we tinuro sa atin during our elementary days, that there's a food web. There's a lot of linkages that put things together. And what makes biodiversity important is because of those functional linkages. So extinction cuts off those links, or at least endangered species loses the ability to be more effective as functional linkages. So in these times, we face on impacts of disalignment, broken linkages, and often lead to unnatural mutations. So these are unnatural outcomes. So for example, with this species here, it is a critically endangered bleeding heart from Negros. It's a frugivore, so they actually have linkages to the forest in terms of ecosystem services, such as dispersal. So you lose something of that link by losing that particular species. There are several publications now that's linking the importance of understanding the pandemic that we're experiencing nowadays with that of the Anthropocene. So one of these is the one from World Wildlife Fund called "The Loss of Nature and the Rise of Pandemics." So it's actually you can download this PDF. So it's a very long document, interesting to read. But I took excerpts on it just to give you an idea what our current situation is. So here. A few microorganisms such as pathogenic bacteria and viruses, or even parasitic protozoa, just like malaria, can have significant negative effects on human health. And I think we often just focus on that particular impact to human health. But we also need to think that we're impacting nature itself. That's why amplifying those issues. So conserving and maintaining nature and the benefits it provides, such as our ecosystem services, is essential for preserving our own, not just our own health, but also the health of the environment. So it's well-being of not just us, but everyone in the environment. And I think that's part of the thing that we sometimes lose because we are so egocentric. We think of, ay, pandemic tayo lang apektado. But actually we're affecting everything. And we're actually the one causing or amplifying some of those impacts. Another paper by Chin et al., also available online, The Anthropocene in the Age of Pandemics. So here Chin discusses, Chin and their colleagues discuss that diseases, epidemics, pandemics have occurred throughout history. It's an amazing array of things that we actually in our generation have faced. One might recall the bubonic plague, which of course killed a lot of people in the past. Smallpox. Of course, eventually we find solutions to minimize those impacts. Spanish influenza in the 1920s, and more recently, HIV/AIDS in the 1980s. So a lot of these diseases have caused a lot of impact to human health. And it's only when it's more worldwide and widespread that it becomes a pandemic that we tend to be more aware of how to resolve those or mitigate those impacts. So in recent decades, we had SARS, bird flu or avian influenza, the more related swine flu, H1N1, and then MERS, of course, Ebola, and then Zika. So a lot of these different diseases are often associated with wildlife because they have linkages to zoonotic diseases. And some of them already discussed here by Professor Alveola and Professor C. I think one excerpt from one of those papers I've read was from John Vidal, who's a reporter from the Guardian. And in this paper, Pandemics, Humans Are Culprits, I think it just narrows it down. It's not a blaming thing, but it's what we do that causes these impacts to magnify. So it's easy to blame this beautiful bat, which is a Hippoceteris diadema, but it's our wanton destruction of nature and the traditional habitats of species responsible for the pandemic gripping the world right now. So it's easy to say, ito yung source, that's the one causing it. But we have to take a step back and think about it. What are the causes of those outbreaks anyway? It's actually leading to something. So I think it's important for us to look into biodiversity and how we have to conserve and protect biodiversity to help mitigate those impacts. So experts concur that the loss of biodiversity, mainly because of us, directly connected to the spread of these deadly diseases, including COVID-19. And I think we should learn from the past. I think that's one thing. We never learn from the past. But I guess in the case for Filipinos, we should look back and what are the things that have impacted us. So there's three major pandemics that occurred and impacted the Philippines in the past. SARS, for example, because it was centered around Asia and Southeast Asia. The Spanish flu in 1918, as well as the recent swine flu, H1N1. So there's actually a blog that was done by Miss Pobre, recently on 3 world pandemics and epidemics that hit the Philippines besides COVID-19. And it's amazing because she has sort of these short excerpts of how we responded and what have we learned from them. I think one of the key issues in terms of impacts that the world has experienced, but the Philippines didn't really have a grasp into, was bird flu. So if you remember, there was this massive outbreak of avian influenza in the early 2000, 2004. And I was actually in Hong Kong when one of the outbreaks came out and actually experienced firsthand, because I wanted to go to the zoo, I wanted to go to the aviary and in the bird market, and being an ornithologist, my opportunity to see them. And everything was closed. People were there in their PPEs and everything was closed because there was an outbreak. Well, one seagull was found dead and everything closed down. Amazing how Hong Kong actually responded to that quick. Yung nangyari na yun, one bird was died because of avian influenza. And it made me thought about the Philippines. How fast do we actually react to that? So I actually wrote a paper on maintaining a bird flu-free Philippines, and emphasis on the conservation and issues safeguarding the birds from potential impacts of the influenza. So not looking into the human public health aspect, but actually looking into birds themselves, because it was a seagull that died because of that. Paano pag nakarating siya sa Pilipinas? What would happen if the Philippines had an outbreak of avian influenza and affects the wild birds themselves? And to me, the paper actually revolves around more on biogeographic issues, that because we are an archipelago, natural transfer, because endemic species being restricted to their island, don't usually transfer those diseases. So it's more of unnatural transfer, which might be an issue. So outbreaks are So in the Philippines, we're bird flu free for many years. It was only recently that they actually had recorded bird flu in the Philippines. And most of these outbreaks are farm related. And so these are not from wild birds or migratory birds, although they were able to affect the wild birds around these farm areas. I think those studies were done by UPLB through the College of Veterinary Medicine, and they actually put out a seminar series about the impacts of these diseases on Philippine wildlife. So one of those reports was by Dr. Lastica Ternura that ensured that pathogenic events in wildlife are investigated and approaches to prevention are formulated to promote conservation. So now we're going into the set of pandemic. Excuse me, I'll just have to put a hold on this for a while. Dali lang po, stop share ko lang because apologies. Give me 2 minutes.
Okay na?
Okay. And share. Sorry, I have to redo it again. Share. Yeah. Apologies for that. So going back. So we must focus on the novel pandemic, but not to forget that all the existing tropical diseases that have been occurring. We do have experienced dengue, malaria, and schistosomiasis. Actually, here's a photo of Agusan Marsh. I was actually there for some time, put my hands in the water, and then somebody told me, ay, may schistosomiasis dito. Tapos na nilagay ko na po yung kamay ko. But yeah, it was interesting to take note that there are still all these diseases that we are still facing in spite of the pandemic. And there's a lot of studies being done from both the zoonotic part, where it affects both humans and primates, as here in the paper by Dakuma in 2012. And also there are ongoing studies to link the importance of vectors, such as mosquitoes, studying mosquitoes on the impacts of dengue. There are also studies that are associated with species that we know are host-specific. So for example, psittacosis or parrot fever and toxocariasis, which is a disease that comes from the toxocaria worm, are basically species-specific, host-specific, but have jumped hosts, including humans. There's a paper by Salazar that in 2018 that determined that there is low impact on some of the parrot species, including the blue-nape parrot shown here, from a group of birds that were tested in the Ninoy Aquino Parks and Wildlife. And then you have a paper by Fahotag and Palir on Toxocara. Both the cat and dog Toxocara were actually found in some playgrounds. The eggs were found in some places. So there's that potential of impact on human health. But I think not all of these diseases that wildlife has can affect humans, because most of these are host specific. And it's interesting to note that it's actually being a Philippines as an important laboratory for evolution. We all these endemic species and restricted range species, it's things that have evolved in unison with their parasites or the diseases that they carry. So a lot of the, an example would be the avian hemoparasites, such as Hemoproteus, Plasmodium, and Leukocytozoon. These are blood parasites of birds, and often they are co-evolved, or they are co-specific to a particular group of birds. And they have actually kind of this arms race between them, trying to get ahead of both as a parasite and as a host. So there's a paper by Ong in 2015 looking into that prevalence of hemosporidiums in birds in Mount Manahaw. There's relatively high prevalence of predominantly chronic infections, suggesting birds are currently able to keep infection intensities in check, but because again, nagbabalance sila at some point. So I think it's important for a parasite to think, I'm not going to kill my host because I need my host. So there's this balance effect in terms of the infection intensities. But the problem is, one, they can check it, but cannot guarantee once they are immunocompromised. So it's these impacts from outside sources, usually man-made, which can cause these potential disease outbreaks. To focus more on these specific impacts between parasite and host, a lot of endoparasites and ectoparasites and their associated diseases are usually co-evolve specific. So you can actually see here a photograph of the Columbilivia, or the domestic pigeon, sometimes a feral pigeon, and it's co-specific feather lice. And it actually happens for a lot of bat flies, with fruit bats and insect bats having their associated bat flies, as the same thing with bird lice or malophagan lice. So here's a paper by my student Fabregas, together with Benavente in 2015, noted that 8 genera of bird lice, or these feather lice, are actually restricted only to a group of birds known as hornbills, or Bucerotiformes. And there's evidence of this evolutionary process restricting that interaction. That means there's limited possibility for them to be zoonotic because they are co-evolved. To a point that even the genus or the name is named after that particular group. So Buceronirmus is a genus of bird lice associated with the Buceros group, which is the hornbills. There are also studies, as earlier explained by Professor Viola, bat viruses and microbes. There are also microbes that are from bat guano, or from the gut of these bats, and both can be looked into as sources of potential medicine. So they can be future vaccines, or in the sense, the microbes in the bat guano can be a basis for novel antibiotics. And one of our researchers here in the Museum of Natural History, Dr. De Leon, actually had a study on the bacterial diversity of bat guano from certain caves here in the Philippines. And it's a first report on the metagenome of these particular groups of microbes that inhabit the bat guano. And again, there is increasing interest in the study of cave microbes because of their potentials for sources of antibiotics. And as we have experienced through this pandemic, COVID-19 is linked to the Wuhan wet market, and it's also linked to that bushmeat trade. But the problem is, as what explained by Professor Viola and Professor C, that we continue to eat bushmeat. We still think of wildlife as an alternative source of protein. It may be because it continues, not just because of the difficulty of getting resources, but also because we crave for it. I think some of the drivers that are causing the continuance of meat trade is more of familiarity. Even people who can afford still eat bushmeat. So there's a paper, the thesis by Dr. Paz in 2019 as part of the dissertation, looking into drivers and patterns of wildlife hunting trade in Mindanao, which includes some of those bats that are being hunted for the bushmeat trade. And again, bats being a good source of protein, we go beyond thinking of their importance. Bats, of course, are important because they provide ecosystem services, both for the seed dispersal, pest control, so many things you could think of that bats provide. But they are also still considered as a delicacy. And in some point, I remember they're being called as an aphrodisiac, better than Viagra, sabi nga nila. Flying foxes, because of their large size, will ride more meat. So they have declined, they've become threatened because of that impact of hunting and trade. They are vulnerable to overhunting because of their slow reproduction. Vulnerable to overhunting because of their slow reproduction, because 1 or 2 pups every per season. It's sad because they are being caught using hooks. So they put out these hooks in the canopy, and that's where they catch most of the flying foxes. So again, that is a part of a study that was done by Dr. Paz in Mindanao. There is that preference for wild game meat, because sometimes called pulutan. Um, it's not just for people who have requiring alternative sources of protein. It's also part of the upper and the middle class. It's part of their, probably their, not the culture, but it's part of their experiences that they, oh, masarap talaga yung bayawa. Ay, masarap talaga yan. So even though they can afford to buy out the regular meat, they'll still crave for that. And sometimes that's a problem because it actually fuels the market, because somebody will buy to be able to chase this. So it's not just bats, but also all manners of edible wildlife, such as the Philippine duck. Some people still crave meat for wild pig, even though most of our pigs are endemic and severely endangered. Even our deer and our monitor lizards. You often think of monitor, madami pa sila. Not really. Some of our monitor lizards are critically endangered. And even that interest of trade because of untested and unconfirmed traditional medicine. Remember that scare with the tokai gecko? Everybody wanted to buy toko all of a sudden, and of course died down. So a lot of these impact trade in wildlife, and of course reduce and causes that decline, and then impacts that flow within the linkages or functional linkages between the environment. There was a recent viral news about a tamaraw being slaughtered and eaten for bushmeat. So it's critically endangered. Just less than 1,000 left, less than 500 left in the world. Of course, it causes an impact on the gene pool. The next problem would be, of course, the associations. And it's human nature for us to fear something we cannot control, something that is unknown. So the more awareness and understanding of how transmissions occurs, the more we could better equip us to tell the people, you shouldn't be afraid of bats and pangolins. They're more afraid of you than we are. But there is some sets of potential persecution of wildlife because of that fear. There was a time that people feared civets because of SARS, and of course, people were afraid of macaques because of the Reston virus that impacted the Philippines. And again, looking into that importance of biogeography in understanding Philippine wildlife, there's a lot of species that evolved in specific habitats in specific island regions, what we call Pleistocene aggregate islands, complexes or faunal regions, and endemic bird areas, which all share kind of these unique distributional patterns between wildlife, birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and even freshwater fish. So that impact actually causes the same evolutionary process of having them more restricted in range, and because of the smaller area of occupancy, have a smaller population, and thus threatened endemic wildlife. And it's the problem that have a small population impacted by disease and causing the decline. So these unnatural transfers of diseases, such as bird flu, for example, impacting the population of this critically endangered Walden's hornbill. There's only found in, well, used to be found in 4 islands, now found in 2 islands, and the last stronghold is in Panay. And what happens if that particular population is impacted by bird flu? Then not having all their eggs in one basket, to lose one species after the other. So there is that risk of impact from these pandemics, not on humans, but on our endemic wildlife, which is part of our natural heritage. And that goes through with all the more important species, what ifs, as we call it. What if the impact was on threatened endemics? The Philippine eagle, for example, what if bird flu affects the Philippine eagle? It's our national symbol. Even though it's found in 3 islands, still movements of humans, a transfer of domestic birds in between those islands can bring something, whether it's a bird flu or something else that is more notorious in terms of a disease. Swine flu, for example, has had an impact on captive wild pigs. We don't know what has happened in the wild. What if, because we still have native pigs, which can be infected, and we practice some sort of free-ranging native domestic pigs that can then also affect the wild pig population. So the Visayan market pig is one of the most critically endangered species of pig in the world. The recently split Palawan binturong can easily be affected by SARS. as well as all the other civet species in the Philippines. So it's one of those what ifs that we are fearing because these are vulnerable populations. It's not also just the ones that are zoonotic that we think are seriously important to be aware of. These other global pandemics are actually affecting other species and potentially affecting species in the Philippines. The honeybee die-offs, we don't know how if this particular disease can impact native honeybees in the Philippines. The same thing with studies now being done on chytrid fungus. Chytrid fungus has actually affected a lot of populations of amphibians around the world, some causing the extinction of some species. In the Philippines, we do have some infection, but we have no recorded species have been severely affected by the chytrid fungus so far, but studies need to be done to determine if there is a decline. So in conclusion, I think what we get from this message is that there is an advantage of us being an archipelago. It's important we are not just 7,100 islands, or 7,600 islands. And that separation, that barrier, actually helps protect the endemic species from all these different regions. So because it's the same archipelagic setting that induce us to have insular evolution, these island endemics, and all these co-evolved parasites and diseases with them have restricted their transfer. So it's more of what the problem is minimizing. Actually, that particular archipelagic setting minimizes or actually prevents natural transfers, because one bird can easily bring the disease to another island, especially if they're island endemics. It's more of the unnatural transfers that would be an issue. What if somebody brings a diseased fighting cock, which didn't undergo the proper quarantine, it didn't have it checked, and bring it from one end to the next, and that actually spreads a particular disease. So maraming klaseng scenarios that can happen. Or just not putting your foot in the foot bath because you came from an island with swine flu. It says, oh, please please step into our foot bath because you want to be swine flu free, but you didn't step in because your nice shoes, you don't want to get wet. So that actually starts a chain reaction as well. So it's these small things that we're worried about, how humans can then magnify the problems that we already have. And hopefully we learn from this, not just at a human aspect, but also understanding the side of wildlife. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Hopefully we get through this pandemic, not just as humans, but also protecting biodiversity and natural heritage at the same time. And thank you. I'll get you back to.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Gonzalez, for that wonderful talk. Now we are opening the floor for questions, and I have a few questions here. Can we please allow our three speakers to please turn on their videos so that they can listen to the questions? Okay. I would just like to remind the audience to post all your questions via UPOU Network's chat room, YouTube comment box, or Facebook comment box. Okay, here is the first question, and I think anybody of you can answer this one from Maggie. Why do certain species possess viruses? Are these innate? Maybe we can ask Philip to answer that question.
All right. A lot of animals, actually, I think almost all animals, all species carry viruses, naturally occurring viruses. So it's not just a special thing that there's a certain family of animals that are well endowed with viruses. So a lot of animals, actually, most of the animals, actually, or all animals, have viruses in them. And as Dr. Jason has pointed out earlier, so these viruses and these animals that harbor them have undergone co-evolution to such a way that it confers no pathologic manifestations to the host itself. So there's a co-evolution that's been going on for several millions of years. So no, there's no certain species. There's no species on the pedestal. The first honor, ika nga, special about that. So all animals.
Okay. Can I follow up with this question on bats specifically, Prof. Alviola? Okay, are all bats harmful and deadly? From
Yeah.
Haskell Ferrero.
Yeah, I really wanted to answer that. So the bats are not harmful and deadly. Dr. Gonzalez pointed out in his lecture that bats provide very important ecosystem services to man. First off would be, of course, pollination and seed dispersal, which aids in the fruit industry and in forest regeneration. And some of these bats are insect eating or arthropod eating, so they can help in reducing agricultural pest populations. And in some cases, they can also eat arthropod pests that have public health importance, like, for example, mosquitoes that cause malaria. So they provide very valuable ecosystem services. So they are not harmful in a way. And although my talk would have probably give an impression that there are deadly viruses in the bats, but there is the viruses that we are experiencing right now, the COVID, the SARS, um, they're they are totally different from the viruses that have been found from bats. They're close, but there are certainly enough differences to state that they are definitely different. So, and there is no smoking gun yet that would directly link bats to humans in terms of disease transmission. It always involves a it always involves intermediate host. For the case of Ebola, for the case of SARS, MERS, and the SARS, the COVID-19 that we're experiencing right now. So the viruses that are found on bats, they're naturally occurring. They can be potentially zoonotic. They have the potential to be zoonotic, but we don't have any evidence yet, direct evidence, no smoking gun yet, that would link bat viruses harmful to humans.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Alvera. The next question is for Prof. Gonzalez, JC. Is it possible that SARS-CoV-2 can be transferred into an avian disease? Can it become avian disease?
Good question. I'm not familiar with the epidemiology of SARS-CoV. Because it is mostly mammalian, I'm trying to point out that a lot of zoonotic diseases start out as host specific. Often they jump to a particular because of mutations. So there's a change that they are able to become transferable to a species that it's not its natural host. So it is also because of certain mutations that certain pathogens can, of course, transfer to a new host. So in that case, very unlikely, but I'm not going to say no, because again, there can be human impacts that we don't know might cause certain things to happen. And that's the point of the talk, was we have to mitigate our own impacts on the environment. Stop thinking about ourselves and stop thinking about biodiversity and how we impact, and start actually magnify certain changes that occur.
Okay. The next question is directed to Emerson. Emerson, is there a government institution or maybe a private institution that conducts information dissemination regarding the diseases that wildlife can transfer to humans?
Yes. So pag regarding sa mga zoonotic diseases, that will be fall under Department of Agriculture. And in fact, meron very active sila, especially during the avian influenza nung early 2000, no? They were very strict with importation, particularly with infected countries. So may mga institutions na gumagawa. Sa DNR as well, they are doing informational campaigns, especially sa mga migratory birds and so on. And in Palawan province, that will fall under the PCSD.
Okay. I have another question directed to you, Emerson. How is the pangolin trade then being regulated in the Philippines? You mentioned a lot of confiscations and a lot of intercepted pangolins. What happens to the people who are caught doing the trade?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Kasi under the law, killing a pangolin can result in 12-year imprisonment and 1 million actually, 1 million pesos in fine. Pero so far, wala pang nabibigyan na ganong kabigat na parusa. May case last year, may tatlong traffickers na huli sila sa Tagaytay, sa Cavite. It was, it's a great job by the police. May checkpoint, nahuli nila tong mga traffickers. Unfortunately, ang penalty lang nila is 20,000 peso fine. And hindi sila nakulong dahil nag-apply sila ng probation.
Okay. Prof. Gonzalez, I think this is next question. It can be addressed to you. Civet cats are animals from the wild. Do they carry harmful virus? And can the virus be transmitted via civet coffee?
I'd like to add pala dun sa muna about avian influenza. It's amazing because our government agencies actually work together to prevent us from keeping us bird flu free for many years. Kahit, if you remember, there was a map that was always shown around covered na ng avian flu ang mundo, pero Pilipinas na lang yung hindi tinatamaan. It's actually quite sad because nagkaroon pa rin tayo eventually, but still quite restricted now. So that's how people can work together to prevent certain outbreaks from occurring. And I think that goes true with civets as well. If there's certain measures to prevent kung malinis yung environment, especially for those which deal with coffee or civet coffee, I don't think you can because you have to cook the coffee. So any pathogen, whether SARS or not, any other disease that you may get from an infected civet, may proseso kasi. As again, if you're clean with your, whether it's a farm or the way you collect the seeds from the wild, malinis and properly done, I don't think there's an issue of getting any diseases or pathogens from it. And also because the process of coffee making prevents you from getting it from the coffee itself because you have to cook the coffee.
Okay. This is another question. Any of you can answer this question. What triggers such virus to evolve every, nakalagay dito 20 years, no? So maybe after some time, no? And really give chaos to the whole earth. So any of you can answer that question?
I'll take a shot at it.
Okay.
I'll take a shot. Okay, right. From my talk earlier, because pandemics are a rare event before the 20th century. They're a very rare event. What is happening right now over the last 100 years, 20th century, the 21st century, is that we've been seeing several pandemics, several outbreaks. It's because of what I said earlier, is the narrowing interface between animal population and the human population, or the animal habitats and the human habitats. And of course, a lot of drivers have hastened this narrowing of interface. So what we're looking right now is almost close contact with humans and wild animal populations, and of course, that could trigger a jumping or a zoonotic event. And as for bats, bats usually shed virus on a regular basis. Well, it can be linked with reproductive condition when they're pregnant. So that's one of their mechanisms in order to discard viruses in some ways. So yun nga lang, if na timingan, usually pagka nag-shed ng virus yung bats or in some animals, so that's when the viruses are in the outside environment, and it can be a free for all. It can be an open season for other animals to come in contact with those with that virus shed virus from bats. So yeah, what I said. So going back, so there's a narrowing interface between humans and animal population. So there's bound to have the rate of pandemic showing up in a very short interval is now increasing.
Okay. Anybody else? Doc JC and Emerson? Gusto
Okay,
niyo sagutin?
I think it's just a proper way of handling siguro yung contact with wildlife because we are part of the environment ourselves. In a sense, if you look at we're also a species and we are also considered wildlife in some way. It's just how we share the environment. I think that's important. How the impacts that we create. Yun nga yung in the Anthropocene, masyado nang marami tayong intertangling from climate change to habitat loss. Ang dami nating impacts, and by mitigating some of those impacts, you reduce whatever magnification that occurs in terms of zoonotic diseases. Yun nga, how do you minimize certain pathogens from mutating and becoming zoonotic? So you minimize the impact in terms of bakit ba na-transfer itong bat na to lumapit dito at nagkaroon ng contact sa tao because either habitat loss or yung meron kinain mo because of bushmeat. So you cut off that connection or minimize that connection. And of course, common sense, it just reduces the potential impact. So one again is stop eating bats to reduce the impact. Stop eating pangolins. Diba? So it's just a matter of cutting off that connection. You can still appreciate them in the wild, or you can still appreciate them around you as long as you minimize and mitigate the impacts.
Okay. This next question is for Emerson.
Sufficient. However, yung appreciation ng court natin, no, hindi ganun eh. Sometimes they even give less than minimum prescribed by the law. So it's quite ironic na hindi nasusunod yung batas. I don't think na required na baguhin yung mga penalties na nakasulat na. In fact, mataas yung mga penalties. For ordinary citizen, 1 million pesos is a lot of money. And I don't think anyone wants to be jailed for 12 years. But again, yung napaka-baba ng appreciation ng court. And I think primarily it's because yung court is always thinking about the welfare of the what do you call this, the accused. So yun yung ano. May photo ba ako?
Para kayong CNN reporter.
Tawagin yung anak ko.
Okay. The next question is direct. Hindi, bago muna tayo magpunta uli kay JC, no? Prof. Gonzales, there's this, hindi, bago muna tayo kay JC, babalikan ko muna si Emerson. You mentioned the pangolin meat as a luxury food. Do you have any idea how much the pangolin meat costs if you have it served in a restaurant in Manila?
Yes, actually, when we started to study the pangolin trade, ang bentahan was about 10,000 to 15,000 pesos.
Wow.
Per pangolin. But in the last couple of years, umaabot na hanggang 30 to 40,000 pesos per pangolin ang bentahan.
And who are the usual clients of the meat? Kasi kung bush meat naman siya, ang regular Filipinos kasi hindi naman talaga kumakain ng pangolin meat, di ba? So,
yes, exactly. In fact, karamihan sa mga Pilipino hindi alam yung pangolin. Pero ang kadalasan kumakain nito mga foreign nationals na, pumunta dito tapos naghahanap ng mga exotic meats.
Okay. Dr. Gonzales, I think this will be our last question unless there are other questions. May isa pa, no? Do plants acquire viruses like animals?
They have certain diseases of their own, pathogens that affect plants, but I don't think there are, ano ba ang tamang term, phytonotic diseases that can affect humans from plants. I think there are certain chemicals that plants produce and toxins that affect humans.
Okay.
But I don't think I'm in a position to say that there are associated. Siguro may pathogens that live on plants that you may get. Siguro baka may tawag nila epiphytic or na nakakabit dun sa halaman na pwede mo makuha, but not necessarily being from plant to human. Diretso. I'm not sure. I'm not in a position to say that being a zoologist. But yeah, I don't think you can. Marami po tayong again, plants are both beneficial and harmful. And sometimes part of the harmful is sometimes tweaked to become useful. Di ba nga marami pong toxins that if you then become medicines, it's just like venom, you can have anti-venom. So I think that's the thing that we need to look into is biodiversity provides us with all the answers. So yung nakakatakot is, if you remember, there was a story, sino nanood ng Medicine Man? Ayan, di ba naalala niyo yung story, nung hinanap nila yung source of the answer for cancer, akala nila nandun sa bromeliad, yung pala nandun sa langgam. Sorry, spoilers po. Pero panoorin niyo na lang siya ulit. Pero nga, nasunog yung forest, so nawala yung... So what if it happens to us because of our impacts? Yung palang solusyon dun sa mga problema natin might be the answer to keeping at bay certain diseases just like COVID-19. Ay sagot ay nandun sa batguano, ay nandun sa halaman or sa halaman na nagpo-provide. Like yung naging ano natin na quinona, yung sagot sa yung the same medicine for us for malaria helps reduce, sabi nga nila, whatever studies it is, might be there's a plant, animal, or microbe that would be the answer to helping mitigate that impact of a disease.
Okay.
So losing one will affect the other.
Okay.
Conserve biodiversity.
Okay. We're now on the last segment of our webinar. I'd just like to ask the last question, giving you 2 minutes to answer the question. What do you think is the future of wildlife and humans? Yan. Yun lang. JC, can you start? And then Emerson and then Philip.
Well, I think the future is good because we are starting to understand a bit about and increasing our awareness. In the Philippines, why is dati talagang malaking disparity? Yan sa wild, yan sa gubat, yan. Now, because we're understanding even urban biodiversity and urban wildlife, we're now appreciating wildlife a bit better. We're also now understanding the impacts of invasive species. So in a way, I think our understanding is a lot better now because of greater awareness. It's just a matter of in continuing that awareness for us to improve our relationship with wildlife. I mean, compared than before, still some of the issues are continuing. It's just a matter of, we have better protection now. There's better laws. It's a matter of properly implementing them and continue follow through. So hopefully the future is good. And wildlife and human conflicts don't increase.
Okay.
Thank you.
Emerson? Thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez. Emerson, your last 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think mas nagiging aware na yung mga tao, especially pagdating sa mga illegal wildlife trade. Kailangan lang talaga na may mas maraming participation. Hindi tayo pwedeng maging bystanders dahil yung old thinking na it does not affect me, so why should I bother? Obviously, hindi applicable sa nakikita natin dahil katulad na itong nangyari sa pandemic, although hindi tayo yung kumakain ng bushmeat, ang karamihan naapektuhan, no? Hindi lang karamihan, but lahat naapektuhan ng pandemic. So in that sense, hindi tayo pwede maging bystander. So we have to participate. We need to help the government implement the laws and to prevent another pandemic from happening.
Okay. Thank you very much, Emerson. And Philip?
Yeah. With the pandemic that's been happening, particularly targeting, with bats and pangolins involved, medyo pessimistic ako na konti because, we are, like for example, for this webinar, we are still getting questions from viewers that saying or asking questions about, are bats harmful, are bats deadly enough. So I think what's happening in the pandemic, it has magnified the negative connotation lying behind bats, magnified the negative connotation lying that they provide. So we in the conservation world, particularly in bat conservation societies, we will have a major uphill climb in overturning the misconceptions that are perceived on bats. So not optimistic, but we'll try to be somewhat realistic enough. And these misconceptions can really pose a severe challenge in overturning our what we think of bats in general.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think that wraps up our webinar for today. I would like to thank our three esteemed speakers, and I would like to read the certificate of appreciation that we will be presenting to these three speakers for today. Okay. The Faculty of Management and Development Study presents the certificate of appreciation to Professor Philip Alviola, to Emerson C., and Professor JC Gonzalez as guest speaker. Okay, nasa na ba yun? Held during the as guest speakers during the Let's Talk It Over webinar entitled Wildlife Friend or Foe in the COVID-19 Pandemic, held on September 17, 2020, live streamed via UPOU networks, given the 17th day of September 2020. Signed, Consuelo Habito, Program Chair, D. Menrem, and our Dean, Primo G. Garcia. Now, I would like to remind the audience regarding the evaluation form that you should answer to be able to receive your e-certificate. A QR code or link to the evaluation form will be flashed on the screen, and this evaluation form will be available for 12 hours after the webinar. Okay. We would also like to remind the audience to check the entries they put in the evaluation form, especially their name, as it will be reflected in your e-certificate. From the webinar today, we can say that in today's lingo, the relationship of humans and wildlife is complicated. But we humans have the moral obligation to take care not only of ourselves, but also of our environment. We need to understand that relationships are processes between players or agency, and that our very existence relies heavily on how we take care of our environment, as it is the only habitat we know and where we have thrived for eons. Professor Alviola emphasized on pioneering research on viruses that occur in bats, such as the coronavirus, hantavirus, and gamma herpes virus as examples, with some of these viruses having the great potential of creating pandemics due to climate change, habitat encroachment, and loss. Emerson C. looked at increasing wildlife trade of pangolins, specifically scales, meat as luxury food, and skin, with the terrible consequence of transferring zoonotic diseases in the process. And lastly, Dr. Professor JC Gonzalez emphasized on how pandemics and wildlife have wreaked havoc during this Anthropocene epoch, but also on how parasites and hosts have co-evolved together for thousands of years. So indeed, we can really, exist together without causing these pandemics. Humans continue to look at wildlife as delicacy or luxury food, an omen or a sign of good luck, food preference, and medicine. And in this culture, this has caused the narrowing interface between humans and wildlife. So what do we need to do? As nature respects boundaries with wildlife, having limited ranges, humans must also follow suit by minimizing these unnatural transfers. So I would like to thank our esteemed speakers for today, and also to thank the listeners or participants who listened to our webinar. Again, I would like to remind the audience about the certificate. The link and the QR code are shown on the screen. And please, the evaluation site shall be accessible after the webinar has ended and shall be open for only 6 hours. So the certificate shall be issued within 3 days. Now, we have also another Let's Talk It Over for September 30. And this is Plastic and COVID-19, a double whammy of a pandemic on September 30. It's a Wednesday from 10 a.m. And another one, which is scheduled for September 23, which is a Wednesday before September 30, Public Health Preparedness Amidst Pandemic, Nursing Experience. And this is on September 23, 2 p.m. Okay? So, again, thank you very much. Maraming salamat po sa ating mga speakers for today and sa ating mga listeners. Magandang tanghali po sa inyong lahat.